Okay, for those of you who are online, the video images cut out, so I don't know what happened. But first of all, everyone, thank you for your patience. And for those of you who are here, thank you so much. I was thinking when I moved to 7 that some of y'all may went, okay, we're going to go Zoom. So, but I do thank y'all for being here. This is class 5, PA 509, Applied Political Economy. And tonight, last week, we talked about a very important topic of externalities, which I really like to reinforce because it's something that I've learned to really appreciate and focus on in my own professional work. We're going to talk about tonight 2 of the most significant issues facing the implementation of public policy, and really getting into 2 areas of challenge that truly exist. And when you look at how policy succeeds or fails, it's development of and response to these areas, and that's coordination and commitment problems. So that's going to be our focus tonight. And we will stay on time, so we will end by 8:45. First, we're going to take we did prisoners dilemma last week, so we'll take that out. That was from last time I taught it. We will go right into the reading, chapters 5 and 6. First talk about coordination problems, and then talk about commitment problems. And if we have time to do an exercise, we'll see how things go, and then we'll talk about the week 6 assignment. Are there any questions? One thing I will also mention is that I have been very late in posting videos of the class recordings. Those will go up this week. So that will be taken care of this week. So all the recorded video recordings will be up for viewing by the students. But that should be fine. So let's get into coordination problems. So the chapter 5 starts off with talking about something that I personally know a little bit about growing up in Tennessee, and that is the development of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Just to give some perspective, rural electrification was one of the most significant public and private, but primarily public sector infrastructure investment projects of the 20th century. The only thing that comes close to it, or actually supersedes it, would be the development of our highway system. First, the federal highway system pre-World War II, and then the development of the interstate highway system after World War II. But without electrification, the southeastern United States would be far different than it is today. And we're experiencing it right now because for about 6 months out of the year, it is hot. Carolinas, all the way going west to the Mississippi, and then you get into the southern Midwest or Southwest, if they like to call it. It is hot. And while the climate is really good for farming, it is not good for just about anything else. And as a result, the ability to actually run electricity and provide power to residences and industry in those parts of the country, from Tennessee all the way down through Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, as well as parts of Florida, all of that was pivotal to its expansion and development throughout the 20th century and its economic transformation. And generally speaking, that's been good for the U.S. as a whole because it's expanded the space inside the United States by which industry could operate. Manufacturing, which was our primary source of economic activity for most of the 20th century, needed space. You needed space to have factories. You needed workers. You needed to go where the workers were to some extent. And so the ability to run electricity throughout the Southeast was essential. And that would not have happened in the time in which it happened without the TVA. At that time, most of the rural Southeast, and by rural, I would mean pretty much anywhere without a population of at least a couple of thousand, did not have electricity. It just simply did not exist. At that time, almost all electricity was locally generated. Generation was not something that was centralized at nuclear plants or large-scale energy production plants. Most of it was locally produced. And so either you were served by an investor-owned utility like we have here with what's now known as Duke Energy, or if you were fortunate enough and lived in a large enough city, you would have your municipality raise the money and start up its own electric utility. And so as one of the projects, and probably this and also the Bonneville Power Administration out in the Northwest, these two entities probably have some of the longest lasting results of the New Deal in terms of their development. And what the chapter starts off talking about is that there was of course the direct effect associated with this investment in infrastructure, but there were other impacts or externalities that were seen as a result of this massive growth of investment. And that was facilitated because TVA primarily relied on hydroelectric power for its production and its creation. So they built a series of dams throughout the course of the Tennessee River and some other tributaries. They were aided also by the development of dams by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which were tied into the system. And they built this network, and they also built some coal-fired plants, but primarily it was hydroelectric. And that process took about 30 years to fully complete. And during that time, there was, of course, a sizable amount of growth and development that occurred. And it occurred both in not only in manufacturing, and the fact that this area became possible to expand manufacturing throughout these areas, but also it helped increase agricultural production because it helped improve farming methods, and it also it potentially helped farming methods, and it also connected these areas of growth to the marketplace. What happened after that phase of investment in order to build out this grid ended? What happened after that investment period ended? Yes.
Didn't agriculture decline?
Yes. So manufacturing continued to grow because it was relying upon the infrastructure that was there. So it could continue to grow, and it's continued to grow to some extent. That area has shifted from a manufacturing standpoint away from a less modern to a more modern manufacturing, from finished textiles and other types of products like that to electronics, cars, mechanical equipment. But the agricultural sector, which is a very wide variety in that area, cash crop, traditional cash crops like here in North Carolina, tobacco, cotton, and corn and wheat, but also vegetables and other things, and livestock, a more diverse livestock than we have here, declined. Why? I think you got into a little bit about that. Why did that happen? Why did one sector grow and the other sector not? Or why did it decline? Yes.
We talk about, say this wrong, the economies of agglomeration. But just essentially like certain industries coordinate in certain regions. So there can be coordination among the manufacturing companies. If you have a number of people who can work in manufacturing, then that industry can grow. But it seems like it's more limited to the land you have available and
Correct.
ability to work it.
Absolutely. One of the biggest differences between farming in that part of the country, what we've referred to as the Mid-South, and farming here in the Mid-Atlantic, is that typically farmlands are much smaller. Typical large farm in that area is about 500 acres. Here, they can be 5,000 acres or more. So the economies of scale to facilitate production, particularly in eastern North Carolina, but also in the middle, in the Piedmont Valley, are much larger than they are in other parts. And the reason why is land, once you get past the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina, is relatively flat. Whereas in the Mid-South, it is roly-poly all over the place. It's not, there's a different topography, different ways water flows and all that. But the reality, as you point out, is that the manufacturing sector in this time was able to kind of develop its own ecosystem. that allowed it to feed off of itself and to create an additional return on investment that was not just the result of the infrastructure put in place. We take this to today with economic development approaches in manufacturing that are facilitated at the state and local level and to some degree federal level. And that's the reason why auto manufacturers and other very large companies like the chip manufacturer that's going to be setting up in Chatham County receive huge incentive payments. The belief is that by putting this large, this large manufacturer in the middle, that there will be a support system that will be drawn to it and create that agglomeration that won't just yield the jobs tied to the investment, but will create additional jobs to support it. When Nissan built the first auto plant in the Southeast in the modern era in the late 70s, early 80s, right outside Nashville, the plant itself was a pretty significant investment, but there was about a dozen additional plants that opened up to provide parts and support to Nissan. And that then led to GM building Saturn and now the Ford plant and now that GM plant's been converted to an EV plant and Ford's EV plant in Memphis. And throughout Tennessee, there are probably about 30 or 40 additional plants that have come online that provide parts and support for them. And that's the same thing that's happened in Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. And so this is kind of a situation that happens, but let's step back just a second. Coordination problems are a social dilemma. It's another social dilemma like those we've looked at before. In many situations, this is page 151, in many situations, good outcomes require actors to coordinate their behavior in the right way. But two things can go wrong. First, actors may fail to coordinate entirely. This happens fairly frequently. You don't have an absolute buy-in, and that leads to a problem, which oftentimes leads to a suboptimal outcome. For instance, different companies with an industry may locate in different regions, never realizing the benefits of agglomeration. We see that why in the advancement of 21st century technology, why medical research, technology research, these industries have consolidated their physical presence. Silicon Valley out west, what we have here in RTP, the corridor up near Boston. Those are the three key ones. The more hardware-based and now somewhat software-based Mecca of Austin, those areas are examples. And second, actors may coordinate on a bad outcome rather than a good outcome. And this is common as well, that one, you got to make sure everybody, that you want everybody to have buy-in and work together, either intentionally or organically. And in second, you want to make sure you achieve good outcomes. And one of those outcomes it talks about are poverty traps. What is a poverty trap?
Is someone already talking? I'm sorry.
Someone's already talking, but I'll let you talk in just a second.
Okay.
Hold up just a second, Lindsay. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So like countries are only going to invest in like lower in like impoverished countries, and like other countries are going to act in the same way because it's more profitable for them to like create those economies of agglomeration. So if other countries aren't doing it, they're not going to do it, and then the country is going to get stuck in poverty forever. So it's going to invest.
Absolutely. Lindsay, was there anything you wanted to add?
No, that was basically it. Yeah, that people just don't, if they don't see that they're going to get a return on their investment, or they're not sure if they're going to get a return on their investment because a country is impoverished and they don't see other people investing, then they're not going to invest either, and they get trapped in a spiral of poverty. Yeah.
Right. So the traditional view about trying to bring an impoverished area up, whether it is another country, like our ongoing attempts to redevelop Haiti, which have been going on for decades, or even more domestically, the challenges that we have in various urban, particularly urban areas of our cities that have been distressed and disinvested, and I happen to live in one, is this challenge that exists where trying to get the parties from is typically the only way that it's seen to facilitate economic growth and development is from the outside in. And this is something that's very common. And it's as true with private investment as it is with public investment. When you look at the triangle, you see most of the money that's been invested here has come from the outside. Other parts of the state, other parts of the country, other countries, whether it be government, from government entities or from private investors, most of that money is not local. And that's the traditional example of how you facilitate economic development. Factory moves in, that's not a local company that builds that factory, that's from another part of the world or another country that says we want to locate a factory there. And so the challenge is that obviously one we talk about, and it was talked about earlier with, I believe, the concept when we were looking at earlier on with respect to collective goals, that there's a need to achieve some kind of critical mass. The Research Triangle Park would not have worked with only one university here. It works with the fact that it has three. So the reality is that you have to have that collection. And if you're not able to achieve that collection, the parties involved don't make the investment. So the same conversations we had earlier about participation and such apply here on a different scale. And so it leads to a situation where there's some areas that can achieve and then there's other areas that can't. Yes.
So how do so loan opportunity not going to come in general?
Those loan opportunities come, but that's not what's going to drive the needle, except for Belton Road. That's a totally different scale. Right? For those of you who don't, everybody here know what Belton Road is? Okay, Belton Road is it's really an infrastructure, it's a direct infrastructure program that is being facilitated by the Chinese government. The Chinese government is going to less developed parts of the world, primarily in Africa and South America, and is literally building highways and other things. But highways are the key things. And they're doing this because they're looking to how to expand not only their economic representation broadly, but also their political ones. So it is, instead of just giving money, they do give money, but instead of just giving money, they also build out these massive infrastructure projects that are happening in these less developed parts of the world. And it's not something that's known as well. Most people know, of course, about IMF, World Bank, and those things. What happens in those cases is that they try to prime, those are more like priming the pump, or what we call priming the pump, trying to get that first amount of money in there that hopefully that goes directly to the government, and hopefully it stabilizes matters or provides some degree of guarantee or some degree of confidence from a stable international organization that then it encourages other parties to get involved. Its success rate's not very high. It's like some other US grant programs, but it is something that's done. But we deal with, but we have these challenges and we try to figure out how we can deal with it, because what we see today in a lot of cases is that much of the work we deal with in policy, particularly from an economic policy perspective, is how to address challenges in specific areas, whether it's a specific region within a state, a specific community, or on an international level within a specific country or a specific group of countries in a particular area of economy. That's primarily what we deal with. And you have to be able to effectively coordinate, otherwise challenges occur. So the way we teach this, that works a lot better than me sitting up here and teaching it, is that there's all these different game models that come up. And I apologize, I did not share this until this afternoon, and I should have put it in the folder earlier. So I'm going to play this. This is about 8 minutes long, and it's just an example of coordination games and kind of an introduction to game theory. We will talk more about game theory later this semester, but do want to spend a little bit of time on it.
Coordination problems arise in a variety of economic, social, and political situations. These situations can be modeled as coordination games, as illustrated by the following examples. Imagine two cars are driving down a road toward one another and will soon meet. Each driver can choose to stay to his right or to his left to avoid the other car. Since they are facing opposite directions, if both drivers choose to stay to their right, or if both choose to stay to their left, they will end up on opposite sides of the road and they will avoid hitting each other. However, if one chooses left while the other chooses right, they will end up on the same side of the road and collide. This scenario illustrates the classic coordination game, which refers to a situation where the parties involved can benefit from choosing the same course of action. If both drivers can agree to drive on either the right or the left at all times, they will avoid the accident. This coordination game can be illustrated in a payoff matrix as follows. The strategies for driver 1 are represented in the rows, and those of driver 2 in the columns. Driver 1's payoff is listed first, and driver 2's is listed second. The specific payoffs don't matter and are meant to illustrate the relative attractiveness of each option. The negative payoffs capture the fact that if the players fail to coordinate, they'll have an accident, which harms both drivers. If, however, they can coordinate to both drive on the left or right, they will avoid an accident and successfully pass one another, producing a positive payoff. It is important to note that this game has two Nash equilibria, left-left and right-right, illustrated by the highlighted cells. For both of these outcomes, neither player can improve their situation by unilaterally changing their strategy. The central issue in these types of situations is determining mechanisms that allow people to coordinate on one of the two equilibria. How might two drivers both agree to drive on the right side? There are various mechanisms that could potentially work, and we'll discuss some of those in a bit. But before doing that, let's consider some other examples where the logic of the coordination game is applicable. First, consider the adoption of technology and the associated network effects. Network effects, or network externalities, refer to situations where the value of a good or service increases as others adopt it. Examples include the telephone, email, or social media platforms. For example, having a telephone, if no one else does, is useless because you can't call anyone. The more people who have telephones, the more valuable it becomes to you to have one. A key issue is whether the technology used by different companies is compatible across products. If it is compatible, if say an Android and an iPhone can call each other, then users of different products can interact, which increases the size of the network effect. Companies also benefit from a larger potential customer base. This means that technological compatibility presents a potential coordination problem for companies. If two companies each adopt a technology that is compatible with the products of the other, both firms can increase their total sales. Consumers can then purchase products from either company with confidence that they can be used with the products from the other firm. So both companies see a benefit if they adopt the same technology, regardless of which technology option it is. As in the opening example, this situation has two Nash equilibria, and both are equally good. If, however, the companies select two different technologies for their products, they'll be incompatible, and the sales of both firms will be lower. Another well-known illustration of a coordination situation is called the battle of the sexes. The scenario is as follows. A couple has plans to meet, but can't remember if they agreed to meet at the theater or at a sporting event. The husband prefers the sporting event, while the wife prefers the theater. However, both would prefer to go together to the same event as a couple instead of being at either event alone. The off-diagonals, 0, 0, represent a lack of coordination and the least preferred outcome for both the husband and wife. The husband receives a higher payoff if they attend the sporting event, since that's his top preference. The reverse holds for the wife. The two highlighted equilibria are both Nash equilibria, since neither party has the incentive to change their strategy based on the strategy chosen by the other party. Notice that this coordination scenario is different from the previous examples. In the previous cases, the parties were indifferent between the two Nash equilibria because the payoffs were the same. But in the battle of the sexes scenario, the parties each prefer their top choice. So no matter which event they go to together, one person will be less happy than the other. What you need to solve a coordination problem is a mechanism that allows people to create shared expectations about what other people will do. Let's consider two potential mechanisms that would help in the earlier scenarios. One solution is formal standards, which are rules that are codified by certain parties. Standards are rules about how parties are supposed to act. As such, they provide guides for action and interaction. Formal standards can emerge through political or private institutions. For example, government might establish a formal law that all automobiles are to drive on the right-hand side of the road. This law is backed by punishment for deviations from the standard. Where effectively enforced, such formal standards can solve coordination situations, such as the problem facing the oncoming cars that we discussed earlier. Formal standards can also be established by private organizations. For example, many industry organizations, such as the American Medical Association or the American Bar Association, establish standards that their members are supposed to uphold. These standards serve as a coordination mechanism by creating codified expectations of how other members will behave. Similarly, private organizations typically develop standards internally to overcome potential coordination problems between employees. A second solution to coordination problems is social conventions, or informal rules. A social convention is a regularity that is followed by people belonging to a group, a shared expectation of the correct way to behave. While formal standards are codified, conventions are emergent in nature, meaning they are not centrally designed and they are usually not written down. Conventions could potentially influence outcomes in all of the examples we have discussed. Drivers might choose a certain side of the road based on historical experience, even without laws in place. Companies might select a technology based on the past behaviors of other companies, or by other indicators sent by firms as to the technology they will adopt. For example, a company might write a press release, hire certain talent, or acquire a certain company to indicate to others what technology they are adopting. The husband and wife might rely on a convention to determine which event to attend. For example, perhaps they always alternate, so if they attended a sporting event last week, they'll attend the theater this week. In general, appreciating the role that social conventions play in creating social harmony is crucial to understanding how people solve a wide variety of coordination problems.
So we know that the easiest way to solve coordination problems is through the first example of formal standards. We know that to be true. And we know that it is possible to solve them informally. As to retort, so what are the challenges associated with trying to solve them informally? Yes.
No accountability. walk away and say, well, I decided to do my way.
That's always a possibility. That's always a possibility. And in a, the problem is, so Lindsay, so everyone, the question I have is, so the question I'm asking is, we know that formal standards, laws basically, laws and regulations, enable us to effectively coordinate. That's one of the reasons why we have them. We also know historically that there are many things we do that are informal, more social conventions, as described by the speaker, that do have some track record of success. However, what are the potential risks of that? How do those informal conventions not work? And the question that the answer was that that people sometimes just choose not to abide by social convention or by informal standards. So what are some others? Yes. Correct. Social conventions change over time. And not only do we not behave the same way or have the same standards from 100 years ago, lots just changed in 20 years. A lot has changed in 20 years. Any others? Right, that there's the possibility of a lack of commitment. We'll get to that when we talk about commitment problems. Social conventions can lead to negative outcomes. That is also true. We also are a more global society. We have learned that from a global perspective, conventions and standards and customs and informal policies are not the same from one place of the world to another. Not to say one is right or one is wrong in all cases. That's simply to say that there are differences. And so we are learning that you have to work with that. This country, this part of the country, particularly this area, is a far more international, has a far stronger international culture with different customs and different informal standards than it did 50 years ago. And so, like, for example, one of the informal customs where I live is that people greet each other by hugging. And when I got there, I couldn't believe that that's what they did. Because I had lived in Tennessee, we don't hug unless it's family. Went to Northern Virginia where nobody hugs, and or not in public unless it's like their spouse or child. And came down here and it was like everybody hugs each other, and it was just very odd. When the speaker at any event says good morning, everybody says good morning back, which it feel like at church every place you go. And these were just things that I wasn't familiar with. Nothing wrong with that one. The hugging thing needs to change because not everybody feels that way. And there are definitely certain issues with that when we're talking about women and men. But the reality is that we do have to rely more on formal standards, whether they are matters of law or matters of regular or some kind of process of formality. And that's where our role in public policy has grown more significantly because we are dealing with a more heterogeneous society. Our society, from a perspective of who's in power and also serving and also doing our best to serve all people of our society, is far more heterogeneous than it used to be. Yes.
What do you mean, Sam? I'm from Jersey originally.
Okay,
So Jersey,
yeah.
I was born in Jersey, lived there for a couple of years, and was pretty much raised in Baltimore, Maryland. So let's say beeping the horn is common and normal. normal,
Right.
north or whatever. Coming down here, you don't really hear.
Unless somebody wants you, unless somebody wants you to move or you pull
Yeah.
in somebody's way.
Mhm. And also in the north, you don't really hear sir or ma'am. I didn't grow up saying sir or ma'am
Right.
at all. So I guess that would be an example, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
My wife is deaf
Okay.
and, so you talk to people who don't know and get into massive conversations. If you walk by someone on the street who have the same accent as you. But she's known them for 10 years. To start signing,
Mhm.
being congenial with each other and that, walk away and I just like, do you know that person? No.
But it's just,
Yeah.
it's that cultural commonality of having somebody who's of the, it's like if I see somebody, like whenever I wear this, go dogs is typically said by somebody. When I'm not here, but you get the idea. But NC State 3-0 as well, so we're all happy, everybody's happy.
In Toronto, California.
Yeah. So what we want to do, and this ties into it, is that you're trying to achieve what we're trying to achieve in these scenarios is we're trying to figure out how we achieve what are known as strategic complementaries. The benefit to one person of taking some action that is larger, the more the action is being taken by other people. In other words, you're trying to, again, collectively, using what we know about coordination, trying to figure out how to achieve a greater result. And this can be three ways. As they talked about, you have the pure coordination games in which the only thing the players care about is that they successfully coordinate, like driving on opposite sides of the road, which, as we know, internationally is not always the right side of the road. Here, it's the left, and of course, in England, it's the right. In some other parts of Europe, it's the left, and don't even start with the Caribbean. It's all over the place. But it's the same in whatever country you're in. Second, there are coordination games that have distributional consequences. So, one example of talks in here is about governments trying to harmonize financial standards. They all may agree that sharing a financial standard is good because it encourages trade and foreign investment. However, if different countries have different economies, natural resources, financial institutions, and so on, then they may disagree on the optimal financial standards. For example, in the 1990s, the European Union, what used to be known as the European Commonwealth, decided to create a standard currency, the euro. And the members of the EU joined in, with the exception of England, obviously. And I think there was one or two other countries that didn't participate, but I can't remember which ones they were. But we got rid of marks, we got rid of francs, we got rid of lira, which, that was a terrible currency to begin with. But we got rid of all the other currencies and we stuck with the euro. And generally speaking, the euro has worked very well up until very recently. This is the first real hard hit that the euro has taken, which is why everybody went to euros. Because our dollar was worth more there. That's the first time that that's happened since the 70s. And the reality was that these other countries, particularly Great Britain, chose not to. And Britain had a reasonable argument to make because, one, it's an island nation, and two, its economy does have significant differences from that of the mainland European countries. Now the whole breaking off from the EU is a whole different thing. Third, there are coordination games with a Pareto-dominated equilibrium. In those cases, the games where everyone wants to coordinate, but in which we can all agree that coordinating on one outcome is better than coordinating on another. And from a policy perspective, this gets into trying to strategically, a good example of this again is strategic regional economic planning. When you're trying to say in a given location, What should our focal point be in terms of how we invest public resources to create jobs or to create business opportunities for the local population and also grow the population through inward migration? And you have to get everyone to agree that you're going to put literally, figuratively, all your eggs into one basket and focus on a particular industry. That's easier said than done because not everybody is necessarily going to want to do the same. But in traditional economic theory, you know, that type of coordination in an ideal environment leads to optimal results. But then, of course, and it shows here examples, of course, when it doesn't work and when we have coordination failure. Does anybody want to define for me generally what we talk about when we talk about coordination failure? Yes. Go ahead.
From where coordination was set up internationally,
Okay, that's an example on that. That's an example. That's okay. So it's when we're not able to achieve coordination and it leads to suboptimal and negative outcomes. It is when we are not able to do that. So give you an example of a potential coordination failure from my childhood. So, I'll give you two examples. So some of you guys remember the era of videotape. Some of you don't, but that's okay. I don't remember 8-tracks, so we're all there. So when home-based videotape came out, there were two standards that they tried to market to the public. Sony came out with its own version. Sony at that time was really had established itself as the world's largest electronics company. And they wanted to prove it by establishing their own standard known as Beta, which actually was a very good standard. High quality, smaller cassette, slightly smaller cassette, worked very well. Some of the other companies, primarily I believe led by JVC, but I can't remember, decided we don't agree with that. Plus Sony wanted to charge them a fee for manufacturing the tapes. They wanted to control licensing the property. So JVC and the other electronics companies at the time decided we're going to produce a different standard known as VHS. And so there was a coordination problem in the market because there was Sony making beta players and beta recorders for home use, and there was everybody else making VHS. And eventually, by the mid-'80s, VHS won because Sony had kind of limited itself to only being one manufacturer. The same thing happened in the '80s, mid to late '80s, with the advent of the Macintosh. Macintosh was a far superior computer in many ways to the PC, which was running DOS, for those of you who remember that. But the reality was that Apple would not allow anybody else to make them. So Apple made a better computer, but they could only make so much. They only were able to achieve a certain economy of scale. The market wanted more computers. And then eventually people at Microsoft figured out if we could just create the same similar interface to a Macintosh, i.e. Windows, then we have a chance. And that's why that's one of the reasons why Apple almost went bankrupt before they became the behemoths that they are now. But these are examples of coordination problems from a private market perspective. It gives in here one example we'll talk about in a second, but what are some other examples that you can think of from a public policy perspective that would reflect coordination? Yes?
COVID, policies, like if everyone is employed, it affects the success of stopping the spread in one government area. Like,
Absolutely. So, and what were the influences that prevented that level of coordination here in North Carolina? This is open to the class. I don't want to pick on any one student. This is open to the class.
business.
Business was part of it.
economic disruption.
There were economic considerations.
Misinformation.
Health conditions or perceived health conditions. Cohen talked about that her biggest concern was that based on her statistics, that if you actually looked at the total, and this could be equated different ways, but generally speaking, that the percentage of people in North Carolina that had pre-existing conditions that would make them more susceptible to to problems with COVID was over 60%. So that information was not terribly provided. It was out there, but it wasn't properly distributed. But that, of course, is the most that's a very good example. And again, it runs into some of the challenges we have when we have to realize that we're working in a situation where the authority of the government in this country is limited. With being that it's limited not only by statute or by constitution or those, it's also limited by the will of those that hold the position in terms of how much power they choose to execute of that with which they have. Like my favorite examples is that obviously we have hurricanes in eastern North Carolina, and when we have a hurricane, we pass a disaster declaration. And typically, to make sure we do it to mainly make sure we're eligible for FEMA money. But there are times where we may institute curfews or do things like that if conditions warrant. And there was one town, Scotland Neck, that issued a disaster one during Matthew, where they talked about they must have pulled it from the 60s because it said no alcohol sales, no sale of gasoline. No, I mean, just it was ridiculous with that one. Let's see here. Good one here. Durham and Raleigh government's not really cooperating on creating biotech training facilities. At least that's what I would agree with that to some degree. State has its biotech, its bio research facility. Duke has its. And obviously that seems like a very interesting one because, and Lindsay, do you want to talk about that some more? You don't have.
Yeah, I don't really know like too much about it. I did some research for my former boss and yeah, just about the biotech industry and the cities kind of not cooperating on building where to build a new facility. Some people wanted it in their, region versus, a region that would be more, I don't know, beneficial for everybody because everyone kind of they have their own interests.
Right. So just to kind of piggyback on that. So there is a lot of competition that goes on at the local level, more so than there really should be. And in all honesty, the Triangle region does a pretty good job compared to many other cities and regions across the country. I worked in Manassas before I worked in Manassas, Virginia, before I came down here to Rocky Mountain. And in Virginia, some of you probably know this because you're from Virginia, cities are not part of counties. It's the only state in the country where the city governments are totally independent of the counties, run all their own state supported services, and are not part of the counties. Now, you have the ability to cooperate through cooperative service agreements, and we had a few of those, but we did not have them in all areas. And in some areas, we were downright just non-cooperative at all. And so, for example, the county that surrounds us, Prince William County, they control the land that was around a reservoir that we built for our water system. The city owned the reservoir, but all the land was around it. And that was where they focused a lot of industrial economic development. And we had our own industrial economic development. And there were a lot of times where we were competing against each other. And it got so bad while I was there that one of the things, we had a golf course that was a really nice golf course near this reservoir that was home to an international golf tournament. And when they promoted the golf tournament, they would say live from Prince William, Virginia. Nobody knows where Prince William, Virginia is. You know where Manassas, but nobody knows where Prince William has ever heard of Prince William, Virginia. But that's what they did. But those type of situations can happen. And it goes in here with an example talking about a coordination issue that is going on right now. And we're kind of in the first phase of it, but we're kind of moving forward. And that is what to do with respect to vehicle energy. And I don't want to get too deep into it, but obviously you have a couple of different options. One is that car company, and this was the initial situation where car companies could build hybrids or they could go straight electric. And as this example is now becoming a little dated. This book isn't that old, but things change. The reality that these car companies had was that given where the infrastructure was, what made the most sense? What made the most sense for the car companies for the last decade? Hybrid or electric? Hybrid. Most sense. And that was because the infrastructure wasn't there. I mean, and it's still not there for plug-in, to really have a massive plug-in electric. And we're now at a point where the president has basically called a moonshot that's been backed by regulation to say that by 2035, really 2030, but fully by 2035, that we are going to move where pretty much all new vehicles produced in the United States will be electric. Yes.
Yeah, I had a conversation with my dad a couple of days ago about this. I didn't do research on it stuff, but
Sure, go ahead.
like the state of California will be mandatory for everybody to pretty much have an election.
It'll be mandatory. That will be the only ones that'll be allowed to be sold. So it's kind of like what we went through with TVs in the 2000s, where we used to have tube TVs with big tubes, big boxes, size of a refrigerator in some cases. And with the digital conversion, the conversion of signals to digital, that was able to facilitate the technology that was coordinated to enable mass manufacturing and distribution of the flat panel television set, which we all now love and enjoy, which is far lighter and far nicer than what we had before. And that's kind of the same logic that's being applied here. So what California has done, as you pointed out, is that California has said in 2030, we're banning the sale of new gas-powered vehicles. It has to be electric or something else.
Yeah.
There is another option, which is hydrogen, but we're not here to discuss that. So California is doing it. California is in a position because of its size of its market, its connection to the West Coast, and because of other factors, that it can kind of lead the rest of America in adopting policy. And it's even goes so far is that there are states, and this is an issue right now in Virginia, where they have these bills that were passed years ago, where they basically said, just to make it easier, we're going to be in alignment with California standards. So now that California has said, we're not, no more new gas powered sales after 2030, they're saying, well, we're just going to follow along. Well, except for Virginia, their governor and legislature are wanting to change that. But many states are looking at it and going, well, we're just going to follow along with this. The same thing happens with textbook adoption. Anybody know which state really controls textbook adoption in the United States? Yes, Texas. Absolutely. Texas is not only of course, one of the largest providers of public education in America, they're also one of the most centralized. Because school districts are independent of other local governments and basically follow state standards. So when Texas adopts school books, they're applying it across the state. What that means is the book publisher is likely not going to make another version of the book for, say, Georgia or North Carolina or anything like that. And so when various groups try to advocate for changes in textbooks, they typically try to work it through the Texas system to then get it adopted nationwide. So those are the kind of things that go on with respect to this, and the same thing is true with vehicles. And what we're seeing now is that in order for us to facilitate, what they're doing now on the coordination side is they're basically using the auto market to try to force the energy providing market, i.e. the oil companies, to modify their infrastructure to be able to accommodate this technology. The same thing occurred in the 70s when we switched from regular gasoline to unleaded. They made the car companies install the catalytic converter, which basically forced the oil companies to stop selling unleaded gas. Yes. Sorry, I didn't mean to steal your thunder, but
But I don't know if you remember watching The Price is Right, the cars always had California.
California, absolutely.
Yeah.
And they still do.
Yeah,
They still
and then
do.
that just became standard across, I think, all of America.
There
At
are,
least the US and Canada.
right, now
As
they
far as
do.
the manufacturers are concerned, not necessarily policy. They just manufacture to California.
Right, because there's no reason not to. And also, I'll get you in a second. Also, with the one difference now is with fuel blends. There is a California fuel blend that they don't apply nationwide because it's too expensive to, but it does still create challenges because you don't have full coordination in the refinement industry, which is why typically why gas prices go up, not recently, but up until a couple of years ago, gas prices would go up before peak driving season, because the oil companies would have to reformulate the gasoline in California, which would reduce the supply for everyone else and cause that problem. Yes.
Converter, did you hear about like a lot of people are like still in the converters from buses, especially in senior living communities right now?
Right.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff going. There's definitely a lot of stuff going. So let's finish this out. Yes.
Just on topic of the electric cars, I think they're optimistic about being able to do that because they've gotten some of the larger actors working with them.
Yeah.
Like Tesla is now this year, they said they're going to put charging stations for every brand electric car.
To me, that's a whole big thing because the plug-in to me seems to be the biggest thing. And thankfully Tesla doesn't use a different plug-in, but obviously, I mean, those of you who've traveled internationally know that we don't use the standard, that the outlets are different. They now do sell outlets that are designed to be international, where it'll deal with with different types of ones on the outlet as opposed to having to put the adapter on there. But just even the issue of the outlet in the plug is a challenge there. There's actually a rule that's being passed to the European Union where they're requiring all technology companies to adopt USB-C. Which Apple, of course, is not happy about because they use Lightning. And we'll try to use Lightning as long as possible because they think it's better. I don't know, but they think it's better. Y'all don't remember back in the 90s when we had like 40 plugs. I worked at a Radio Shack and that's how we made a lot of money. Selling 40 different plugs, little knobs that went into things. Which gets to really the first example we talk about here, regulatory harmonization. And getting to those formal means is a situation. There has to be mechanisms to facilitate standardization. And we talked about, it can be facilitated by the market in certain cases. We saw that with videotapes. We actually saw that with DVDs. There were 2 DVD standards at the beginning. There were 2 DVD HD standards. That's why we actually used Blu-ray as opposed to DVD HD. Sony actually won that battle. The reality is that in the beginning, there are going to be differences. And we have to deal with that. But there are circumstances where there needs to be a more formal regulatory approach to actually harmonizing and facilitating coordination. So it talks in here of, you know, like for example, obviously the United States can develop, the United States as a country is large enough that it can maintain its, it can develop its own vehicle safety standards. And we do that nationally. And that's a combination of government regulation as well as industry group standards that are reinforced by a variety of agencies. And over time, that's kind of actually been championed more by the insurance industry. The insurance industry's taken on a greater role in that than they used to have. In Europe, it's a little different because you got all these different countries that each had their own manufacturers, and you had to figure out a way to make it all work together. And they actually went to the UN to do it, which one of the times that UN actually accomplished something. So it's so that's that. Unfortunately, we also, as we talked about earlier, that we do have situations where, as we talked about with social conventions, informal ways that they can lead to problems. And that creates, and of course, it gives some very brutal examples here from all over the world. And there are some brutal examples here domestically that we deal with where these behaviors are reinforced from generation to generation. And that, of course, is known that we think of that as a coordination trap. People are trapped in a self-reinforcing pattern of behavior that they regret, especially future generations. And so we have to deal with that as well. And there are examples, there are many talks in here about some particular examples, but like one example that was documented in medical research was that a medical team goes into a part of South America, I believe, and they come across this native population that's developed this particular brain ailment. And what they find out is that their custom is to eat the brains of those who pass. So it takes them a period of time to work with the leadership of these areas to say, this is not something you should do. They're able to change it, but it's something that can be a challenge. Policy response, we've gone into that. There are a lot of good examples here that for time, I'm not gonna, there's some other information on Nash equilibrium. We'll cover that later. We can talk about game theory some more. Policy responses. Obviously, the most important thing, and you will see this if you haven't already seen it, is communication. The example with COVID is very clear. Not only was there was not unified communication in that response that limited coordination, there was the issue of the distribution of incorrect information that was oftentimes more widely distributed than the information there. And there were oftentimes problems with the way official agencies distributed information. The whole wear a mask, don't wear a mask, wear a mask, that was a challenge in and of itself. So when it comes to communication, we have to be very careful, but it's very important. We also have, of course, the ability to facilitate. Government does have the ability to facilitate intervention to address problems with respect to policy and try to facilitate coordination. in policy analysis, we used an example that happened last week about the rail strike that went on the almost rail strike. There was not a strike. It was, they were able to work it out. And that is something that the federal government sometimes has to intervene with respect to certain labor disputes that have the potential to cause widespread economic and other issues to the American people. And that was done in this particular case. But typically we have to remember, particularly in this country, that government intervention is limited, as I said before, by limits by the explicit power of law, as well as the will of those who use it. For example, many counties in North Carolina could have chosen, their political leaders could have chosen to apply more stringent standards with respect to COVID response, like what we've seen in Durham County, Wake County, and Buncombe, and some other urban counties. But in many counties across the state, there was just simply not will to do that. There was absolutely no will on the part of sheriff's deputies or even us at the city to try to force people to wear masks. We knew we were going to run into a lot of problems with residents, and that was just not something that we had the will to do. I'm wrong just saying we didn't have the will. A lot of places did. Another intervention that it talks about in here is insurance. The government can guarantee players they will not face a bad outcome, even if everyone runs on the bank, then players have no incentive to withdraw their money. So it talked about bank runs before. This happened after the stock market crash, helped facilitate the depression. And so what the government did was it basically effectively, we still had privately owned banks, but it provided a national backup known as the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which guarantees 99% of people's deposits. And so that standard is there to provide the backstop that eliminates, in that particular example, the incentive for people to say, well, if everybody else is running the bank, if everyone else is withdrawing their money, I need to do it too. And of course, another concept from policy analysis is the whole idea of the second best. What do we mean by the second best? Right. You're being realistic, but you're still working to achieve the best outcome. And that is 90% of what we do. Optimum results are not a regular accomplishment, even by design. You're working with the realities of a situation and you're achieving the best, you're achieving the best possible given reality, as opposed to the best possible otherwise. Are there any questions? So now let's go from coordination to commitment problems. So in a commitment problem, one party can take some action that would benefit both himself and another party. However, that first party anticipates in the future the second party will have the power to exploit it. So to get to your example from earlier, that it takes a lot of, that generally speaking, there is this tendency to be two different types of people, first adopters and everybody else. And it's especially true, that's not only true with consumer behavior, it's also true with investment and development of new ideas. And so as a result, it creates a challenge which is inefficient. It's not optimal. The outcome ends up not being optimal because of the behavior, because of the concern that party A has about the behavior of party B. And there are a lot of examples of this in just normal behavior. Group work, let's think about it from the standpoint of group work. We've all had that group project. Not going to happen in this class, but we've all had that group project where you work as a team and it's pretty clear that the two or the three people, that there's certain people doing an unequal amount of work, that the work is not distributed equally. And the only thing that commits you to doing it is the fact that you want to make sure you get a good grade, but you're still concerned about how the lack of effort on the part of another party could damage the project. And that's as true in the workplace as it is in the classroom. So, and now this is something that us older folks are told is not as big of an issue in today's environment because everything in industry is about team-oriented activities. There's less individual work and more team-oriented work, theoretically. But the reality is that we still know that it's something that's always going to exist. And it creates serious number of problems. So when we deal with conflict, it gives an example here dealing with fun times in Ireland for most of the 20th century, talking about the efforts to try to achieve peace between between Catholics and the Protestants, who, of course, primarily the British, who controlled all of Ireland until 1920, and then continued to control Northern Ireland to this day. And trying to figure out how do you finally get both sides to agree to a ceasefire and a standing peace. And what are some of the observations that it makes here from not from a standpoint of behavior, but from a standpoint of some of the concepts that it discusses here? What are some of the observations? Yes.
Even if it's approached with the best intentions by both sides, there's more
Yeah, I mean, that's true in almost all that's true in almost all conflict where there's deeply held resentment or deeply held disagreement or distrust for whatever reason. We deal with the same thing in the Middle East and in other parts of the world. So it gives a couple things to think about. First of all, the prize may be indivisible and utility might not be transferable. In other words, a major problem in finding a negotiated settlement in this particular example, and they switch over to Israelis and Palestinians, is that it's difficult in this particular case to divide Jerusalem between them while preserving the value to either, because Jerusalem is not all Muslim stuff on one side, Jewish stuff and Christian stuff on the other side. It's all interspersed. And it's not the same as what happened in Berlin after World War II, where the communists were able to say, okay, we want the eastern part. And they kind of let the Allies, primarily us, but technically the Allies, have the western part of the city. Totally different situation. And that's how we were able to maintain relative peace, even in Berlin, which was surrounded entirely by communist East Germany. Second, players may disagree about how likely each of them is to win a dispute. If they are both overly optimistic, then there may be no deal that they're both willing to take. In other words, along with distrust, it could be the idea of, well, we think we're going to win. Why, I mean, they may be saying, why should we concede? Why should we give ground? We're going to win. And if both sides feel that way, if one side feels that way and the other side doesn't, then you can reach a settlement. It's going to be more mutually beneficial. It's going to be more beneficial to the side that thinks they're going to win. But you have the opportunity to reach a settlement. If they both think they're going to win, that could be a problem. Commitment problems as well. While a mutually beneficial deal exists, the players may have concerns that the deal will not be honored. We have examples throughout, particularly in the last 50 years, of conflicts around the world where ceasefires are reached and are avoided almost as soon as they're reached. And so as each time you try to reach a settlement fails, you end up having a continued lack of trust. That creates further resentment and can cause problems with conflict. So it leads to this idea that we call inefficient conflict, where a lot of times people act in a way, and it gives the example here of the Irish Republican Army. The Irish Republican Army would have a tendency to, the IRA would have a tendency to initiate conflict on a pretty regular basis. And they would do this because they realized that it gave them momentum to argue for a better settlement. That if they simply showed up at the table to negotiate without showing what they were capable of, that the result would be that they would be not in as strong of a position to be able to get what they want. And we see that time and time again. We see that oftentimes that even while negotiations are going on, there's often a tendency for violence between parties in international conflicts to intensify. It talks in here also with respect to what happened in the Balkans in the 90s. There's just a whole host of challenges that come up in these situations. So obviously warfare is one, our warfare and armed conflict is one example, but what are some other examples where these similar issues with commitment would occur, these similar problems would occur? Yes.
My first thought is tackling with used car sales.
From a market perspective, yes.
Walking out.
Yes, yeah. Yep, that would definitely happen. Yes.
Would like the
Say again.
the Iran nuclear deal? That'd be one.
That could possibly be one. That's in a little different ballpark, but there's similarities to that. Right now it's kind of interesting that there's that this situation is occurring at the same time when the Iranian government decided to abuse a woman, basically killing her as a result of her injuries for the crime of taking off her headscarf. And the fact that it's happening at the same time is leading to a somewhat small popular uprising in Iran now. It's kind of been the flashpoint to another uprising. We saw one similar to this during the Obama administration. And interestingly enough, during both times, shortly after that, deals were reached. The first deal and now possibly the reaching of the second deal. The example I gave before, which you don't have to worry about as much here in North Carolina, union negotiations. Don't have to worry about labor negotiations with governments in North Carolina. But very similar tactics, threatening of strikes, walkouts, wildcat strikes, slow, call-ins. That's happened recently with the City of Raleigh Fire Department. They're not unionized, obviously, but they've been articulating now for over a year, actually multiple years, that they are not being properly compensated for their work compared to other jurisdictions. And they've started now taking a series of actions to try to force the city to take them seriously with respect to that. That's another example. There are cases in public policy where we deal with this. Economic negotiations. We've talked about, what do you do about incentives to bring a company there? There are also examples of what you have to do with incentives to keep a company in a certain location. We had a situation like this in Rocky Mount about 8 years ago. We have a major employer, or really only biotech manufacturer, who basically came to us and said, we need some kind of incentive that will help sweeten our plans to invest in the plant to actually create more jobs. Otherwise, we can't achieve the economy. Their argument was, otherwise, we can't achieve the economy of scale of this plant necessary to keep it open. But you have a choice. You either provide the incentive, which is a very rich incentive over 10 years, or you don't provide the incentive and that company walks. It's over 1,000 jobs. So those type of situations happen in public policy as well as happening in the marketplace and also in ways that are not violent. So let's talk about the holdup problem. And I've got enough time that I think I can show this video. Yeah, I'm going to try to find a cut point here, but I want to show this video to kind of give an overview of the holdup problem.
Hold-up problem. In economics, the hold-up problem, or commitment problem, is central to the theory of incomplete contracts, and shows the difficulty in writing complete contracts. A hold-up problem arises when two factors are present. The hold-up problem is a situation where two parties may be able to work most efficiently by cooperating but refrain from doing so because of concerns that they may give the other party increased bargaining power and thus reduce their own profits. When Party A has made a prior commitment to a relationship with Party B, the latter can hold up the former for the value of that commitment. The hold-up problem leads to severe economic cost and might also lead to underinvestment. Underinvestment. It is often argued that the possibility of a hold-up can lead to underinvestment in relation-specific investment and thus inefficiency. Underinvestment occurs because investors cannot guarantee themselves a sufficient share of the return through ex-post bargaining. Consequently, predictions of the outcome are very sensitive to assumptions made about the bargaining process. The bargaining process can be seen as a game with multiple equilibria. Underinvestment may occur only when the agent fails to coordinate on an efficient equilibrium. Principle. In a scenario where two risk-neutral parties S, supplier, and B, buyer, can make profit by working together, it is efficient to work together as long as the buyer's valuation exceeds the seller's costs. Schmitz, 2001. When the two parties could agree on a binding contract covering the whole period of the investment and anticipating all possible outcomes and providing protection for both parties in every situation that may arise at the time the investment is made, the parties would have enough confidence to make the investment, and both parties could enjoy high profits. Then, it can be assumed that there are no wealth constraints and there is no private information. According to the Coase theorem, voluntary bargaining results in trade whenever it is efficient. However, making such a contract is often not possible for these four reasons. The initial contract can cover only short-term situations. Eventually, renegotiation is needed, which provides an opportunity for example, S to hold up B. As S knows that the investment is a significant cost to B and tries to use this as leverage to negotiate an increase in its prices. In that case, S has more bargaining power, compared to B, and tries to use it to its own advantage. The source of power lies in the investment of B. For B it is hard to find out whether or not the raise in price.
Okay, that's a little hard to understand, and I apologize, but I was sharing it because I had not shared this with y'all before the class. Y'all had a chance. If I had done that, y'all would have had a chance to watch it at your own pace. So I'm going to stop it now. But the holdup is basically a reiteration of what we talked about with commitment problems. And they use the example of car dealerships, which is interesting because there's now another side to this, and that is that there's another holdup problem that's occurring with cars, and it goes back to Tesla. So Tesla wanted to be able, as a car manufacturer, to sell its cars direct to consumers without using dealerships. And what they ran into is that in most states, you can't do that. You can't make, you are not in a position to be able to, you have to have a dealer network, and those dealers have to be owned independently from the manufacturer. The manufacturer can't own the dealership. So that was done to prevent, that was done kind of in the antitrust protection when the whole concept of auto sales started in the early 20th century. Actually know a couple of people who are car dealers and have owned dealerships, and they could come in here and spend hours here talking about the unique economics and financial mechanics of trying to run a new car dealership. Used car dealerships are relatively easy, but new car dealerships are crazy. But Tesla was running into a problem, and it was a holdup situation because these laws were already in place, most notably in Texas. People think of it as a live free or die state. Texas is not exactly. It's got some freedom, but it's not a pure live free or die state. And these dealers, of course, are opposed to this because what they don't want is the law to change and to give the manufacturers that they serve the idea we can do this too. Because the dealers are now in a position of, well, geez, well, this would reduce our cost as well, because of the nature of the arrangements that exist between manufacturers and dealers. Dealer doesn't entirely pay for the right to own a dealership. They actually get money from the manufacturer. There's kind of a trade-off. There's kind of a two-sided exchange. And so these dealers look at it and go, wait a second here, this doesn't sound right. And so they have fought it, which is why Tesla has opened up dealerships like the one that they have on Glenwood. And they do have a subsidiary company that does they've created kind of a subsidiary company, I believe, to facilitate the independence in an easier to handle fashion. But it is a significant difference compared to how it's done in a lot of places. Which is why for most people, if you want a Tesla, you just got to order it online or however it is people get it. Yes.
For the newer how are they able to just deliver it to your driveway?
Well, they can deliver it, they just can't open up a dealership. And for some of those guys, they haven't delivered a single vehicle
Or the dealership is farming
yet. True, that too. But you can, a manufacturer can sell direct to customer. They just can't. They can't own their own deal. They can't have their own place to try them out. There are certain it's very weird, and it doesn't make a lot of sense in today's market when there's a lot of manufacturers for products that have learned, let's just not deal with retailers, let's sell it direct. And Amazon, of course, makes that easily because it provides a marketplace to everybody. I was growing up when the outlet mall became a thing. And that was really the first example in relatively modern times of manufacturers actually selling their product direct to customers. Because before that didn't happen at all. You had to go through a retailer. That's why Sears became so big. Of course, Sears basically hardly existed this. So, but these holdups can occur, as I said, in public policy situations. They can occur when you're dealing with policy matters, dealing with a host of issues. Like they can occur because like one of the challenges that we see since the 1990s, we have been encouraged as government to outsource our products and services to third-party private vendors. Prior to the 90s, governments did most of everything they did in-house. So for like an example, I don't know all of how North Carolina State University operates, but prior to the 1990s, most particularly public universities, had their own commissary, which handled food service. They ran their own bookstore. Everything was actually run internally by staff of the university. And in the 90s, all of that changed at most universities. What's the nature now?
NC State is one of the few in the system that still maintains its own.
That's kind of what it looks
So
like.
like we created almost like our own third party.
Got
So
it.
like if you ever eat on campus, you see like Rave Catering, like that's an NC State entity.
Yeah.
That we essentially pay ourselves to.
It's a brand identity.
Yeah, but a
basically.
lot of other universities use, I can't think of the name of the company.
Sodexo, Marriott,
Yeah, like
there's
those
tons
big-
of
those
tons.
big distribution
Yeah.
companies, but yeah.
Yeah. So the first one was bookstores. That was the first one. And there were two companies that were out there buying them or offering to do contract deals, Follett and Barnes and Noble. And they would come to a university and they would say, we'll take it over. You'll not have to worry about the operating cost or hiring staff, and you actually may make more money because they would give a concession. So instead of the university being faced with a situation where it could potentially take a loss, they were guaranteed that they wouldn't take a loss. And so the universities got out of that business. The problem is by getting out of that business, you increase over time the reentry costs if the contract doesn't work out. So eventually at some point that business does not have, that provider does not have incentive to meet the the original obligations of a contract. So for example, that first 5-year contract comes along and they do it and they provide the service. At the end of that 5 year, they're going to want a better deal. And so you're out there then trying to compete. And if you're lucky, it's a particular service or something where there are multiple vendors who can provide the contract. But with consolidation, which also just kind of happened, the reality is there's only a handful of companies out there to provide the service. We also see that with infrastructure. There are a couple of states, Indiana being the most notable, that went through and privatized their toll roads. Indiana has a lot more toll. Anybody here from Indiana? Yeah. Indiana has a lot more toll roads than they have in North Carolina. There's only like 3. And what Indiana was faced with a situation where its toll roads needed to be rebuilt or repaved. And a company from Europe came in and said, we'll guarantee the money for this concession if we take over. We'll guarantee that everything will be maintained if you give us the roads for 50 years. And the short term in the initial phase, it looks pretty good, but long term, what they're finding is that it's not a very good. And so this naturally creates distrust with respect to outsourcing. And this is not always how it happens. First of all, there are situations where a lot of times where local governments or state governments need to outsource certain services because they cannot achieve the scale to provide them themselves. That is going to happen. So there are times where it does make the economic case to use a third party as opposed to doing the service yourself. But there are also a lot of times, particularly when it involves outsourcing when it already existed, where as we learn, it creates a future holdup problem because it makes it harder to take, you really don't have the ability to take it back without incurring significant cost in the process. It only incentivizes them to give you less and less. Does that make sense? So any thoughts with respect to policy response? It really doesn't provide much here. No, obviously, when we talk about international conflicts, using some kind of international authority has the potential to help. The ICC talks here about International Criminal Court. Their first heaviest use was in response to the Balkan crisis. A lot of work there had been used more recently in other cases. But the reality is that commitment, again, it gets to the behavioral nature of the people that are involved in either making policy, implementing policy, or living by policy. And generally speaking, people are not necessarily trusting of one another. So much like coordination is influenced by commitment issues, and it is a problem that you continuously have to work on, find ways to overcome. And we deal with it at the municipal level, deal with it even within a department office. So it is something to understand. Why I don't spend a lot of time dealing with models on this stuff, because this is more about understanding what it is so that you can identify it as you address it. Okay. So our next class will be next week. And it's meant to be on Zoom, and I should be able to do it. I may have to delay the start because of Rosh Hashanah, but it would start no later than 7 o'clock. If anything changes, I will let you know. We'll cover chapters 7 and 8, starting on the constraints of good government, and there should be some additional viewing tomorrow in the week 6 folder. Videos will be up the videos of this class and previous folder will be up this week. Any questions?
The reading assignment.
Yes, yes. The reading assignment that was supposed to be due tonight, but has been delayed because I was late, is due on Friday. All right, any other questions? Thank you all very much and have a good week.
I got a question.
Yeah, if you hold on just a second.
Yep.